April 1943. The North Atlantic is unnaturally calm. Moonlight spills across the water in a thin, metallic sheen, turning waves into slow-moving glass. Far from any coastline, a lone Allied patrol aircraft circles at low altitude, engines throttled back, crew scanning the surface in disciplined silence. There is no gunfire. No explosions. Only the steady hum of machinery and the cold certainty that something unseen is below. For weeks, this mission had been dismissed. Too speculative. Too dependent on chance. Senior officers doubted that Moonlight, of all things, could reveal what sonar and depth charges often failed to find. Submarines were ghosts. The ocean was their refuge. Yet tonight, the sea tells a different story. Beneath the silvered surface, dark shapes interrupt the reflection, elongated shadows where none should exist. The observer leans closer to the window. Then another shape. And another. 4 in total. Not wreckage. Not imagination. Submarines. In this moment, skepticism gives way to evidence. But this night, and the unlikely mission behind it, did not emerge from nowhere. It was the product of a war already stretched across oceans, ideologies, and years of escalating desperation. By the spring of 1943, the Second World War had entered its most unforgiving maritime phase. The battle for control of the oceans, particularly the Atlantic, had become a war within the war, fought silently beneath the surface and relentlessly above it. Whoever controlled the sea lanes would control the flow of food, fuel, troops, and ultimately, victory. Since 1939, German U-boats had pursued a single strategic objective: strangle Britain into submission. The logic was simple and brutal. Britain was an island nation, dependent on imports for survival. Sink enough merchant ships, and the island would starve. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the German submarine force, believed submarines were the decisive weapon to achieve this. Early successes seemed to prove him right. By 1940 and 1941, U-boats operated with alarming freedom across the Atlantic. Allied convoys were poorly protected, radar coverage was incomplete, and air patrols could not yet reach the mid-ocean air gap, where ships sailed beyond the range of land-based aircraft. In this vast, unguarded space, submarines hunted almost at will. The statistics were stark. In 1942 alone, Allied shipping losses reached catastrophic levels. Hundreds of ships were sunk. Tens of thousands of sailors and civilians died at sea. The ocean became a graveyard measured not in headstones, but in tonnage. Yet by early 1943, the balance was beginning, slowly, to shift. The Allies were adapting. Convoy systems improved. New escort vessels were commissioned in large numbers. Radar sets became more reliable. High-frequency direction finding, known as HFDUF, allowed operators to triangulate U-boat radio transmissions. Most importantly, air power began to close the Atlantic gap. Long-range patrol aircraft, such as the consolidated B-24 Liberator, extended Allied reach deep into waters once considered untouchable. Still, the challenge remained immense. Submarines were designed for stealth. When submerged, they were nearly invisible. Sonar could detect them, but only under the right conditions. Depth charges were effective, but imprecise. A U-boat commander needed only minutes to slip beneath the surface and disappear into the darkness below. It was in this environment of technological arms races and mounting losses that Allied commanders began exploring unconventional methods of detection. The goal was not simply to react faster, but to see the unseen, to expose submarines at moments when they believed themselves safe. One of those moments occurred at night. German submarines, particularly Type 7 and Type 9 U-boats, were not true submarines in the modern sense. They were submersible surface vessels. Their batteries were limited, and underwater endurance was short. To recharge batteries, ventilate the boat, and maintain speed, they often traveled on the surface, especially at night, when darkness offered concealment. Night had long been the U-boat's ally. But in the right conditions, it could also betray them. Moonlight, reflecting off calm seas, could reveal subtle disturbances, shadows, wakes, unnatural silhouettes interrupting the surface. To some observers, this was a theoretical advantage. To others, it was unreliable, too dependent on weather, phase of the moon, and human perception. Within Allied command structures, proposals to rely on visual moonlight detection were met with skepticism. Resources were limited. Aircraft, fuel, and trained crews were precious. Missions had to justify their cost and results. But the pressure to reduce shipping losses forced experimentation. Small units. Specialized patrols. Crews trained not only to rely on instruments, but to trust their eyes. By 1943, the Atlantic War had reached a critical juncture. Losses on both sides were rising. German U-boat crews faced increasing danger, while Allied sailors still died in the thousands. The margin between survival and catastrophe narrowed with each convoy crossing. And somewhere within this grinding struggle, a mission was authorized, not because it was widely believed in, but because the situation left little room for disbelief. That decision would soon be tested under a moonlit sky. The German submarine force entering 1943 was not the same force that had terrorized the Atlantic 2 years earlier. On paper, it was larger than ever. New boats rolled out of shipyards in Kiel, Hamburg, and Bremen at an impressive pace. Crews were trained quickly, sometimes too quickly. Losses were being replaced, but experience was not. U-boat commanders now faced an enemy that was learning faster than anticipated. Allied escorts no longer sailed blind. Radar sets could pick up a submarine's conning tower at several miles, even at night. Air patrols were increasingly coordinated with surface ships. When a convoy was attacked, the response was immediate and layered, ships above, aircraft overhead, sonar below. For German crews, the psychological strain intensified. The Atlantic was no longer a hunting ground, it was a trap that slowly tightened. Dönitz himself acknowledged the growing danger. Yet the strategic necessity remained unchanged. Germany needed to disrupt Allied supply lines, especially as preparations began for a future invasion of occupied Europe. This pressure pushed U-boats to operate closer together and for longer durations. Wolf-pack tactics, groups of submarines coordinating attacks, were still employed, but radio transmissions made them vulnerable to detection. Every message sent carried risk. Night surfacing remained essential. A U-boat on the surface could move faster, conserve battery power, and reposition for attack. Crews believed darkness protected them. Many commanders trusted cloud cover and low visibility more than instruments. Ironically, it was precisely this confidence that opened a narrow window of opportunity for Allied observers. At the same time, Allied air forces were refining night operations. Coastal Command of the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Navy's patrol squadrons increasingly flew after sunset, despite the risks. Crews learned to navigate by stars, horizon glow, and instrument lighting carefully dimmed to preserve night vision. Some aircraft were equipped with radar and lee lights, powerful searchlights designed to illuminate surfaced submarines at the last moment. Others relied purely on visual scanning, particularly during full or near-full moon phases, when calm seas could act like mirrors. The concept was controversial. Moonlight was unpredictable. Clouds could roll in without warning. Sea states changed quickly. Visual identification required discipline, patience, and experienced eyes. False sightings were common. Shadows, wave crests, even floating debris could deceive observers. Commanders questioned whether such missions justified the risk. Aircraft operating at night were vulnerable to mechanical failure, navigation errors, and enemy fire. A single patrol could consume fuel and manpower needed elsewhere. Yet results, when they came, were undeniable. By early 1943, isolated reports began to circulate. Submarines spotted visually before radar contact. Attacks initiated faster than expected. In some cases, U-boats were caught so exposed that they had no time to dive. Still, these reports were fragmented. Anecdotal. Easy to dismiss. What changed Allied thinking was accumulation, patterns emerging from repetition. When conditions aligned, calm seas, strong moonlight, disciplined crews, visual detection worked. Not always. But often enough to matter. Behind the scenes, small adjustments were made. Patrol routes were aligned with lunar cycles. Crews were briefed specifically on visual cues, the straight line of a hull against broken waves, the unnatural stillness of a surfaced boat, the faint wake trailing behind. None of this guaranteed success. But it narrowed the odds. By April 1943, the Atlantic War approached a tipping point. Allied ship losses, though still high, began to level off. U-boat losses, once considered acceptable, started to climb sharply. Entire crews vanished without returning to base. It was within this tightening struggle, between innovation and tradition, belief and doubt, that one particular mission took shape. A patrol planned not around radar returns or sonar pings, but around the quiet promise of moonlight. Most did not expect it to succeed. What followed would force a re-evaluation of how submarines could be hunted, and how vulnerable they truly were when the ocean itself turned against them. And to understand why this mission succeeded, we must now look at it from multiple angles: human, tactical, technological, and moral, each revealing a different part of the same night. At the center of this mission were not machines, but people. Night patrol crews operated at the edge of physical and mental endurance. Flights could last 10 hours or more, with little movement, little conversation, and constant vigilance. Observers stared into darkness until their eyes ached, trained to notice the smallest irregularity, a line too straight, a shadow too deliberate. Fatigue was the enemy. So was doubt. Many crewmen had already flown dozens of sorties without a single confirmed sighting. Skepticism filtered down from command. Some wondered whether these moonlight patrols were little more than morale exercises. Yet discipline remained absolute. Night vision procedures were rigidly enforced. White lights were forbidden. Instruments were dimmed to near invisibility. Crews avoided smoking, even when stress peaked, to preserve visual acuity. In the cold air of the North Atlantic, observers wrapped themselves in heavy clothing, fighting numbness as much as fear. There was no dramatic moment of discovery. No shouted alarms. When a submarine was spotted, it was often first noticed as a feeling, something out of place. The brain registered the anomaly before the eye fully understood it. In those seconds, training mattered. Hesitation could mean a lost target. Overreaction could mean attacking nothing at all. For these crews, belief was not philosophical. It was operational. They believed because they had to. German U-boats were formidable predators, but only under certain conditions. When submerged, they were difficult to detect and dangerous to engage. But on the surface, they were compromised. Their silhouettes were tall. Their decks exposed. Their anti-aircraft defenses limited and often ineffective at night. Commanders surfaced whenever possible. Speed mattered. Battery life mattered. Many believed the odds favored them in darkness, especially far from shore. Moonlight changed that equation. A calm sea eliminated wave clutter. Reflections sharpened contrast. A submarine's hull interrupted the uniform texture of water. Even its wake, subtle, narrow, became visible when light struck it at the right angle. Allied patrols learned to approach from behind or from the side, using the moon to silhouette the target. Attacks were planned to give U-boat crews minimal warning, often seconds between detection and engagement. Once spotted, a surfaced submarine had limited options. Crash dive procedures took time. Hatches had to be sealed. Engines disengaged. Every second exposed the boat to attack. Moonlight removed the submarine's greatest advantage, invisibility. Ironically, some of the most successful detections occurred when technology was not leading the search. Radar could be cluttered by sea returns. Sonar was useless from the air. Radio silence limited coordination. In these gaps, human vision filled the void. This was not a rejection of technology, but a complement to it. Aircraft carried radar and depth charges, but crews were trained to trust visual confirmation before committing. Moonlight patrols were scheduled deliberately, not randomly. Meteorological data was analyzed. Lunar cycles were charted. When technology failed to provide certainty, the environment itself became a sensor. The ocean reflected. The sky illuminated. And the aircraft, suspended between them, became a platform for observation rather than detection. This balance, between machine assistance and human judgment, defined the mission. And it set the stage for a moment when belief would be replaced by proof. But human perception, tactics, and technology were only part of the story. To fully understand why this night mattered, we must examine leadership decisions, enemy assumptions, and the moral weight carried by those involved. Behind every unconventional mission stands a decision-maker willing to accept uncertainty. Within Allied command, approving Moonlight patrols was not an act of inspiration, but of calculation. Resources were strained. Aircraft losses were high. Every sortie carried risk not only to crews, but to broader operational priorities. Leaders were required to justify why planes should fly when radar offered no guarantee of contact. What shifted opinion was not enthusiasm, but attrition. Shipping losses demanded answers. Established methods had reached their limits. Incremental improvements were no longer enough. Senior officers began to recognize that effectiveness did not always come from complexity, but from exploiting overlooked advantages. Authorizing these missions meant accepting uneven results. Some patrols would find nothing. Others would return with ambiguous sightings. Leadership had to shield crews from premature judgment while quietly measuring outcomes over time. This was command under pressure, not heroic posturing, but bureaucratic courage. The willingness to continue a mission that did not always deliver immediate proof would ultimately allow evidence to accumulate. And on one particular night, that patience would be rewarded. From the perspective of German U-boat crews, the Atlantic at night remained familiar territory. Training emphasized vigilance against radar-equipped aircraft and surface escorts. Night was still viewed as a protective layer, especially in open waters far from land-based patrols. Many commanders believed that Moonlight favored navigation more than it endangered concealment. Logs and post-war testimony reveal a dangerous assumption, that Allied detection depended primarily on instruments. Visual spotting was considered unreliable, almost primitive. As a result, some U-boats lingered on the surface longer than doctrine recommended. Lookouts scanned the horizon, but upward vigilance was inconsistent. Aircraft engines could be mistaken for distant shipping. By the time a plane was identified, escape options were already narrowing. This was not negligence. It was adaptation lag. The enemy had changed faster than expectations. And on calm, moonlit nights, the ocean offered no cover for those who trusted it too much. Anti-submarine warfare was rarely personal, until it was. Depth charges did not discriminate. When a submarine was destroyed, there were no survivors. Crews understood this. Every attack meant the certainty of death for those below. This reality weighed heavily on some Allied airmen. They did not see faces. They saw shapes. Shadows. Coordinates. Yet they knew what followed. There was no celebration in success. Only confirmation. Moonlight patrols, with their visual clarity, intensified this awareness. Seeing a submarine before attacking removed abstraction. It was no longer an echo on a screen. It was a vessel, carrying men, moving across water. But the war allowed no hesitation. Merchant sailors were dying in greater numbers. Convoys depended on these patrols. The moral equation was brutally simple: even if emotionally complex. And on the night when 4 submarines were revealed under Moonlight, that equation would be tested repeatedly, in rapid succession, as the mission reached its decisive turning point. The night that would redefine belief began without ceremony. April 1943. The moon was high, nearly full, its light unobstructed by cloud. Sea state was low, a rarity in the North Atlantic, with long, gentle swells that reflected light rather than breaking it. For a patrol crew trained to read water-like terrain, conditions were ideal. The aircraft moved steadily along its assigned track, engines set to conserve fuel, altitude low enough to maintain visual clarity without sacrificing safety. Inside, no one spoke. The intercom remained quiet except for essential confirmations. Every crew member understood that this was the window their training had prepared them for. Minutes passed. Then more. The first sighting did not announce itself. It appeared as a distortion, a dark interruption in the moon's reflection, elongated and deliberate. The observer did not react immediately. He watched. Counted seconds. Adjusted perspective. The shape maintained its course. A wake trailed behind it, faint but continuous. Confirmation followed quickly. A submarine surfaced. The aircraft altered course subtly, careful not to reveal its presence. No radar ping. No searchlight. Visual tracking only. The crew logged position, speed, heading. Then, less than 10 minutes later, a second shape emerged within the same patrol sector. Then a third. Each sighting reinforced what had previously been dismissed as coincidence. This was not luck. It was pattern. U-boats were transiting the area, confident in darkness, unaware that Moonlight had turned against them. Command protocol required verification. The aircraft maintained distance while cross-checking bearings. The crew's focus sharpened. Fatigue vanished. What remained was clarity. The decision to attack was not immediate. Priority was intelligence. Positions were transmitted via secure channels. Other patrols were alerted. The goal was containment as much as destruction, prevent escape, force dives, disrupt coordination. But circumstances compressed choice. The first submarine altered course slightly, likely detecting engine noise. The moment of concealment was closing. The aircraft descended. Only then did the crew commit. The attack was swift and procedural. Depth charges were armed. Release altitude calculated. Timing precise. The submarine began a crash dive, but seconds mattered. Explosions shattered the surface. Columns of water erupted, illuminated by moonlight. When the sea settled, oil spread across the reflection, thick, unmistakable. No debris surfaced. No survivors. Only silence. Within the next hour, similar sequences unfolded. A second submarine was engaged attempting to dive. A third was caught still on the surface, its crew unprepared. Each engagement followed established doctrine, yet each was enabled by something doctrine had not prioritized: visibility. The fourth sighting was different. It lay farther from the original patrol line, partially masked by the time dawn approached, the ocean bore the marks of multiple engagements. Oil slicks drifted. Debris floated intermittently. Radio traffic confirmed that contact had been lost with 4 German submarines operating in the sector. 4. For a mission many believed in only cautiously, the result was staggering. Yet confirmation would not come immediately. Wartime verification took time. Logs had to align. Enemy records would surface much later. In the moment, crews could only record what they had seen and trust that evidence would follow. As the aircraft turned back toward base, the moon began to sink toward the horizon. Its role in the night's events was already fading. But the implications of what it had revealed were only beginning to surface, within command rooms, operational planning offices, and the broader Atlantic War itself. When the patrol aircraft landed, there was no celebration waiting. Debriefing rooms were quiet places by design. Reports were delivered in measured tones. Coordinates were logged. Times recorded down to the minute. Each crew member gave the same account, independently, as procedure demanded. 4 separate submarine contacts. 4 confirmed attack sequences. 4 areas of heavy oil observed. Skepticism did not vanish overnight. Intelligence officers compared reports with other patrol logs. Signals units checked intercepted German transmissions. Naval Command reviewed convoy movements in the region. The burden of proof was high, not because the claims were extraordinary, but because the implications were. If Moonlight patrols could reliably detect surface submarines, then an entire dimension of anti-submarine warfare had been underestimated. Within days, corroboration began to arrive. German radio traffic shifted abruptly. Wolf-pack coordination in the sector ceased. Intercepted messages indicated confusion, then silence. Submarines that were expected to report did not. Post-war analysis would later confirm that 4 U-boats operating in the North Atlantic during this period were lost within overlapping time frames and locations consistent with the patrol's claims. Their crews never returned. The immediate effect was operational. Patrol schedules were revised. Moon phases were incorporated into planning. Visual training was expanded. Commanders who had once dismissed such missions now requested them, not as replacements for technology, but as force multipliers. For U-boat crews, the psychological impact was severe. Survivors from other patrols reported increased anxiety during night surfacing. Lookouts scanned not just the horizon, but the sky. Time spent on the surface decreased, reducing operational efficiency and increasing mechanical strain. The ocean, once trusted as cover, had become unreliable. This shift marked more than a tactical success. It signaled a change in momentum. April and May 1943 would prove catastrophic for the German submarine force. Losses mounted faster than replacements. Training pipelines could not compensate for experience lost. The night when Moonlight revealed 4 submarines did not end the Battle of the Atlantic. But it clarified something essential: the margin of German advantage had collapsed. The Allies had learned to exploit not only machines, but environment, patience, and human perception. The sea was no longer neutral. It could betray. As dawn spread across the Atlantic, the surface looked unchanged. Waves rolled. Light shimmered. No trace of violence remained visible from the air. But below, the balance of a years-long struggle had shifted, quietly, decisively. The war at sea would continue, but never again under the same assumptions. And in the aftermath of this turning point, its consequences would ripple outward, through strategy, morale, and the lives of those who sailed on. The effects of that moonlit night were not announced with headlines or communiques. They emerged gradually, through altered orders, revised doctrines, and a subtle change in confidence within Allied command. In the weeks that followed, anti-submarine operations across the Atlantic intensified. Patrol aircraft flew with renewed purpose. Not because every mission promised success, but because success now seemed attainable in places once considered blind. Night was no longer treated as a limitation. It became an opportunity. Statistical trends began to confirm what individual crews had sensed. April and May 1943 marked the most devastating period of the war for the German U-boat arm. In May alone, more than 40 submarines were destroyed, an unsustainable loss rate. Entire patrol groups vanished. Commanders with months of experience were gone, replaced by younger men with fewer hours at sea and less confidence in their tools. German naval leadership took notice. Admiral Dönitz was forced to confront a reality he had long resisted. The Atlantic had turned hostile. Allied detection capabilities, technological and observational, had closed the gaps U-boats depended on. In late May, he ordered a large-scale withdrawal of submarines from the North Atlantic, conceding, for the first time, that losses outweighed gains. This was not a surrender. It was a pause born of necessity. For the Allies, the implications were enormous. Convoy survival rates improved dramatically. Shipbuilding programs in the United States and Britain outpaced losses. The flow of men and material to Europe stabilized, then surged. Plans for future operations, including the invasion of Normandy, became logistically feasible because the sea lanes could finally be trusted. Moonlight patrols were now integrated into standard operational planning. Crews were trained explicitly in visual detection. Meteorological officers briefed pilots on lunar illumination as carefully as wind and cloud cover. What had once been considered unreliable became routine. Yet the aftermath was not purely strategic. For those who flew these missions, the memory lingered. The clarity of seeing a submarine before attacking stayed with them longer than any instrument reading. The knowledge that 4 crews had been lost in a single night, unseen, unheard, carried weight. There were no bodies recovered. No wrecks marked. The ocean absorbed everything. In German ports, families waited for boats that would never return. Official notifications arrived weeks or months later, offering little detail. Losses were recorded as missing, the sea listed as the cause. The aftermath of the mission extended beyond numbers and tactics. It altered how both sides understood the war beneath the waves, not as a contest of invisibility, but as a struggle where even darkness could be turned into exposure. And as the Atlantic War moved into its final phase, the lessons learned from that night would continue to shape decisions, silently guiding operations far from the glow of moonlight. The long-term consequences of that night extended beyond statistics. Operational doctrine shifted in measurable ways. Allied commanders began to integrate environmental factors, moon phases, sea states, and atmospheric clarity, into planning with the same rigor previously reserved for instruments and intelligence. Visual detection became a legitimate tool, complementing radar, sonar, and code breaking. This change reverberated across theaters. In the North Atlantic, submarine commanders adjusted patrol strategies. Surfaced operations became more cautious, with nighttime movements reduced and dive procedures accelerated. Crews were instructed to minimize exposure, even when darkness seemed absolute. The psychological impact was profound. The sense of invulnerability that had characterized U-boat operations eroded rapidly. In Allied forces, confidence surged. Air crews reported higher detection rates, but also faced the moral weight of knowing that each sighting often led to certain death below the waves. The balance between duty and conscience became tangible, and post-war accounts emphasized the tension in those moments, a silent understanding that skill and observation determined life and death. Strategically, the ripple effects were even more decisive. With U-boat losses escalating, shipping losses began to decline. Convoys crossed the Atlantic with fewer interruptions. By the end of 1943, the Allies had gained effective control over key supply routes. Material and manpower flowed more reliably to Britain, then to the Mediterranean, and later to the European theater in preparation for major offensives. The German Navy could not recover. Experienced commanders, the backbone of effective wolf packs, were lost faster than they could be replaced. Submarine crews faced increasingly desperate conditions, operating under the constant threat of detection, sometimes without the training or experience to survive. Historians looking back emphasize that the Moonlit Patrol was not a single decisive battle, but a turning point, subtle, incremental, yet irreversible. It demonstrated the power of observation, patience, and adaptability. It forced a rethink of what constituted advantage at sea, showing that even the environment itself could become a weapon when understood and exploited. By mid-1943, the North Atlantic had changed fundamentally. The balance of power had shifted from stealth and surprise to coordination and observation. The night when 4 submarines were exposed by moonlight remained emblematic, a testament to the interplay of human skill, leadership foresight, and environmental understanding. This shift would influence subsequent operations, from convoy protection to hunter-killer groups, and even later in the Pacific Theater, where night patrols and visual detection became critical in anti-submarine campaigns. And as the Atlantic's vast waters returned to routine patrols and logistical movement, the significance of that night lingered, a quiet but decisive moment in a war defined by scale, technology, and human endurance. The night when Moonlight revealed 4 sunken submarines was not marked by parades, medals, or fanfare. It passed quietly, almost invisibly, as most victories do at sea. Yet its significance extends far beyond the immediate tactical success. It is a reminder that war is rarely determined by sheer force alone. Observation, patience, and understanding the environment can tilt the balance where machines, weapons, and sheer numbers sometimes fail. For the crews involved, it was both triumph and burden. Triumph in knowing their vigilance had saved countless lives, the sailors, cargo, and convoys that might have otherwise been lost. Burden in witnessing the devastating consequences for the enemy below, men lost in silence, swallowed by the ocean. It was a moral clarity that few could reconcile, yet one that defined the human dimension of warfare. Strategically, the mission demonstrated a shift in the Battle of the Atlantic. It proved that the interplay between technology and human perception was decisive. Radar and sonar were indispensable, but human judgment, aided by something as simple and uncontrollable as moonlight, could tip the scales in ways no instrument alone could achieve. It forced commanders on both sides to rethink assumptions, to innovate, and to respect that even nature itself could become a weapon or a liability. Historically, this moment underscores the broader truth of warfare, that success often emerges at the intersection of preparation, opportunity, and daring. A quiet patrol, a moonlit night, and disciplined observation together reshaped the Atlantic theater, ultimately contributing to the Allied ability to sustain supply lines and prepare for the invasions that would follow. And so, the ocean, vast, indifferent, and often merciless, held both life and death, concealment and revelation. On that April night in 1943, it offered a glimpse into the fragile balance between fear and foresight, between belief and proof. A mission that few trusted became a turning point that none could forget, a reminder that sometimes, even in war, clarity arrives silently, reflected in the cold, silvered light of the moon.